Here we are again, it's dragonfly season, so you may see a dragonfly or two whiz past. Now today we're going to discuss the housing crisis and pulling all the housing levers in a capitalist society. So I've said repeatedly on these YouTube presentations that in a capitalist society, a private investment for private profit, you need competition. Now the Victorian Premier, and Victoria is notorious for privatising its public housing stock and handing it over not just to private investors but to the community affordable and social housing sector, which are basically private entities which manage and in many cases own property on behalf of the state government. So we've seen 30 years of privatisation, well, yeah, about 30 years of privatisation since the end of the 20th century, especially in Victoria as far as public housing is concerned. As I said before, you need competition in a capitalist society to keep a lid on prices. Now when the Premier talks about pulling all the housing levers, she conveniently forgot one lever, and that's increasing public housing stock and stopping the privatisation of what's left of the public housing sector. So let's go through this from the beginning. Now initially, when Victoria was colonised, 700 squatters within 25 years of colonisation owned all the land, dispossessing over 100,000 Indigenous people who had been here for over 60,000 years in the most brutal ways, reducing their population from over 100,000 to around 2,000 by the 1850s. And let's not forget that it wasn't until 1835 that the colonisation of Victoria began. Now with the gold rushes of the 1850s, people from around the world, not just the British Empire, flocked to Victoria. Most, 99%, didn't find any gold, and once the gold rush had petered out by the late 1850s, people were demanding access to the land which the squatters held. And over the next 100 years or so, this struggle continued in its various guises. Now access to land is fundamental to having some type of security. The thing about ownership in a capitalist society is it gives you security. When you lease or rent, there is no security. You're basically a tenant at the behest of the wishes of the landowner, irrespective of government legislation which is put in place to protect your interest as a tenant. Now we've seen various schemes which have been used to allocate land since the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1890s, marvellous Melbourne became bankrupt Melbourne. There were riots in the streets, and in order to maintain their authority, land was given away to people who were unemployed as long as they lived on that land. And you'll see pictures of communities being developed on marginal, non-agricultural land, whether it was on French Island or the Dandenong Ranges. Thousands of people were given 5-acre plots which they couldn't really make a living out of, just to get them out of the city. Now World War II saw a demand for housing, And if you look at the period, post-war period, you'll see returned servicemen and women living in tents, the Melbourne Botanic Gardens and the Melbourne Cricket Ground, the MCG. And it was that push which forced conservative governments to set aside land and build public housing, not just for returned soldiers, but people who aren't actually able to enter the private marketplace. And by the 1970s, about 15% of Victorians lived in public housing. That's government owned and government managed. Today it's about 3% of Victorians live in what's left of the public housing sector. Now, as I said before, the essence to putting a lid on real estate prices is not about migration, and it's not about building enough homes in the private sector. It's not about giving incentives to first home buyers to enter the marketplace, as we've seen currently, and in many cases these incentives, all they do is drive up housing prices and help investors. Now, you've got to remember that in this country, it's the only place in the world that I'm aware of where people get a tax deduction for owning more than one home through negative gearing, which is government policies which was introduced in order to see more housing being developed by the private sector. Now, you will see in this little equation that it's all about the private sector. It's about divesting the state and federal government's responsibility to provide secure accommodation at a reasonable price, which is linked to a person's income, for the people they theoretically represent in Parliament. And now what we've seen is them washing their hands of this responsibility and wasting billions, not millions, not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars, giving resources and assets and money to the private sector to build more homes. It's called corporate welfare, at the same time passing legislation which allows investors, through negative gearing and through the ability to reduce their capital gains tax when they resell that property at a profit. So what we see is people who need a roof over their heads competing with investors who are given a head start in the game by federal and state governments through negative gearing and capital gains tax relief. So obviously, when a particular activity, human activity, is totally dominated by the private sector, what we see is a total lack of competition. A total lack of competition in terms of between the private sector and any other sector. Now, in this country, the collective and cooperative sector is almost non-existent, would be about 0.01% of the housing sector. Public housing stocks are shrinking. State governments are putting more and more money in the hands of the private sector to build more homes. So we reach the ridiculous situation where in order to enter the private housing market, you need to pay off a debt of over $500,000 for a modest 2 to 3 bedroom unit, or if you're lucky, a home. And it's not unusual for first home buyers to enter mortgage arrangements of $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 for just standard accommodation in order to have security as far as their accommodation is concerned. And then they spend the next 30 to 40 years paying off that loan, paying 7, 8, 9 times the worth of that property to the private financial sector. And as the public housing stock decreases, the competition between the various elements in the housing market decreases dramatically, to such a degree that both landlords and landladies can set any rental agreement they wish to pursue because of the lack of available stock. And that leads to the ridiculous situation where the average rent for a modest 3-bedroom home in Sydney is over $800 a week and over $700 a week in Melbourne, and similar prices in other capital cities, with prices just as high as far as rents are concerned in regional areas. So obviously it's a matter of, if you live in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, it's not just a matter of building more housing stock. It's not just a matter of decreasing immigration rates. It's not just a matter of decreasing the number of overseas students that occur, but it's not just a matter of having federal government and state government incentives to assist first home buyers to enter an overheated property market. It's an issue about competition. It's an issue of reintroducing competition in the private housing market. Because whether it's groceries, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's fresh food, the issue is in a capitalist society, duopolies, monopolies and corporations dominate the marketplace at the expense of small business. And it's the same in the housing market. When everything is geared towards creating ever-increasing profits for people who own property and rent property through negative gearing and capital gains relief, we find ourselves in this situation where prices have escalated to such a degree that it's to a ridiculous situation where people are talking about leaving their mortgages to their children. Now, historically, it has never been like this. Historically, and I'm talking about 40 to 50 years ago, what we saw sector. So what that meant in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, that a single wage earner on an average wage could actually take out a loan and pay off a mortgage within 7 to 10 years. I'll give you an example of a property which I'm familiar with. The property was bought in inner city Melbourne in 1982 for the princely sum of $42,500. It was a relatively run-down property on a very small block, less than 200 square metres. The same property sold with no alterations in 2017, which is about almost 35-40 years later, for $1.6 million. What that meant is that property had increased in value 40-fold, while during the same period wages only increased 7-fold. So in 2025-26 we have the ridiculous situation that you need 2 people working full-time in a household to cover the cost of a mortgage. And as I said, property ownership in a capitalist society gives you 2 advantages. One is security, and 2, you have a property which you could sell at a later date. But obviously if you're not an investor, it doesn't matter what the price of that property you sell at, because you're going to have to buy another property for a similar or a lesser price. So let's get back to our original proposition. So how do you improve competition in a private marketplace which is dominated by the private sector, where public housing is a shrinking part and parcel of housing stock. Now, it's quite ironical that a Prime Minister who was brought up in public housing in Sydney by a single parent on social security benefits has forgotten how important it is for people in difficult circumstances to have access to affordable, secure accommodation, and to push people into the private sector to obtain affordable, secure accommodation is basically ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. The private sector is there to maximise profits irrespective of any legislation which has been put in place to protect either tenants or mortgagees. So we now have the ridiculous situation in this country that about 40% of the population rent because they can't enter the private housing market, they don't have the resources. About 35% of the population are paying off a home through a mortgage which can last a lifetime, and about 25% of the population own their property outright, and most of these people are older people who bought property at a reasonable price when there was a strong public housing sector. So let's talk about these levers which they're pulling in order to improve housing stock. Now, these are all private levers which are engineered, created, legislated to support the private sector. You have incentives for first home buyers to enter the property market. Again, that benefits investors as well as first home buyers. You have legislation which allows people to engineer losses on rental properties and claim them as a tax deduction, as well as reducing the capital gains tax they need to pay because of legislation which has ensured that half of any profits which are made, capital gains, are not taxable. And the list goes on and on. So what do you do? Well, what the Victorian government has done, and many other governments are looking at, state governments around the country, they have began to move out of the public housing sector, handing it over to what's called social housing, affordable community social housing. All social housing is large religious organisations or large corporations, many not-for-profit, providing housing for people who cannot afford to enter the private housing market. So how do they do this? By getting government grants, by giving these private providers the ability to increase rents from the 25%, which is normal in a public housing estate, to up to 30%, 35%, and more importantly, they've got the privilege of cherry picking who their tenants are going to be. Unlike the public housing sector, which takes on tenants dependent on need, not profitability. So ultimately, there is only one lever which needs to be pulled in order to increase housing stock and decrease housing prices in this country. And that is federal government intervention and state government support for the building of public housing by the state, whether it's federally or state based, or entering into an extensive spot purchasing program. What's spot purchasing? What it means is houses that are already established are purchased by the government, whether at the federal or state level, and then put on the public housing list. I mean, this is just so simple. The increase in public housing stock means that less people need to enter the private housing market. So if you increase public housing stock by 10%, 15%, 20%, 30%, there'll be less demand for private housing. As there is less demand for private housing, investors will pull their money out of the housing market and invest in other entities, whether it's gold, silver, stock market, you name it, they'll invest it, maybe even two flies crawling up a wall. But at the same time, as investors flee the market, housing prices at the lower end will drop. As houses at the lower prices drop, more and more people can actually enter the housing market, not because of government incentives, but because of reasonably priced homes. So the only way forward is by increasing competition in the housing market. It's not a matter of decreasing migration, decreasing foreign student numbers, giving more money to the private sector, giving money to the social affordable community health sector from the public purse, but it's a matter of increasing public housing stock. An increase in public housing stock does two things, which the Prime Minister seems to have forgotten. It allows children of parents who may be on benefits to live in the same area, attend the same schools, develop the same friendships at an affordable rent, which is limited to 25% of income. So if you're on a social security benefit, it's 25%. So unlike the Victorian government, which has allowed public housing estates to be run down by not doing the necessary repairs and pointing at them and say how terrible they are, they need to be knocked down so we can build, you know, new flats, 90% privately owned and the 10% for public housing, and not public housing, but for social affordable housing. So the reality is we need to increase public housing stock, whether by removing legislation which benefits investors or by ensuring that money which is collected at the point of entry, so when you buy a home you pay stamp duty in the majority of states. The Victorian government collects over $10 billion of stamp duty per year. This is used to build holes in the ground. None of it goes back to the public housing sector. If you use that money to build, manage and spot purchase homes around the state, you could house over 100,000 people every year within the public housing sector and free up the private housing sector from the grip that the investors have on that sector. But when you listen to politicians of all political persuasions except possibly the Greens, when you listen to the commentators, the financial regulators, the financial institutions, the media, it's all about increasing support for the private sector. Nobody, but nobody except a small number of people continue to agitate for an increase in the public housing sector. And this has occurred because the usual groups which have promoted public housing in the past, the large religious institutions, have now been bought by the federal and state government social, community, affordable housing privileges which they enjoy. What it does, as we saw with the privatisation of the Commonwealth support for people finding jobs, what we see is these institutions growing rich and fat at the expense of the very people they claim to represent. That's why you never hear them talk publicly about the need for increasing public housing. It's all about social, affordable housing. So the answers are simple. But it seems there's an ideological blockade. There's a blockade in terms of us thinking that the state should resume responsibility for providing housing for people. In Europe, there are some countries where 40 to 50% of all housing is owned by the state, and people can pass on that residence to their descendants in the public housing sector. Think about it. We want affordable housing. We need to pull all the levers, not just the levers which benefit the private sector. We need to increase the levels of public housing, not just in Victoria, but the rest of the country.